Thanks for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. I'm your host this week, Eleanor Goldfield. We're very glad to welcome back onto the program Karnig Kerkonian, who's a distinguished international and appellate lawyer. Mr. Kerkonian's legal work focuses on suits involving foreign entities in U.S. courts, international sanctions, regime matters, federal appeals, and cross-border transactions. Mr. Kerkonian's public interest practice is rooted deeply in international law and draws firmly on his commitment to Armenian causes. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Likewise. And so the last time we spoke, it was just before the COP climate meetings in Azerbaijan, when the Azerbaijani government was blockading and ethnically cleansing a region known as Nagorno Karabakh, nestled in the mountains between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And as I understand it, in March of this year, a quote-unquote peace deal was agreed upon by both sides after, as corporate media put it, 4 decades of conflict. However, Azerbaijan also said that Armenia's constitution must, quote, eliminate the claims against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Azerbaijan as a prerequisite. In other words, Armenia has to change their constitution to give up any claim to the historically Armenian territory known as Nagorno-Karabakh. So, and there were other issues like Azerbaijan claiming that Armenia was violating the ceasefire, but local EU monitors could find no evidence of this. This sounds very similar to what Israel claims about Palestine. But with that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, it's been 2 months after this quote-unquote peace treaty was agreed upon. Where do things stand as of now with this peace treaty, with the constitution in Armenia and such?
Well, I think that's a great introduction to what we're seeing in terms of a revisionist Azerbaijan and the successive issues and demands that they placed on Armenia. There is no peace. There is no peace treaty that's been signed or even looks like it will be signed anytime soon. But that's kind of a red herring, because I think there's a deeper issue here I think we need to understand. And I think that means putting this quote unquote peace process into historical perspective. I like to look at what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, the ethnic cleansing, what the Freedom House called forcible displacement, which a number of other international actors, including the International Association of Genocide Scholars, Lemkin Institute, and a number of others, called genocide. And it is clear that the goal of Azerbaijan was to destroy the Artsakh Armenian population, literally destroy them. And we see that process continuing today in Nagorno-Karabakh, where Azerbaijan has complete control at this point and is destroying Armenian churches, destroying Armenian cemeteries. And as the president of Azerbaijan said in a tweet right after the forcible displacement of the Artsakh Armenians in September 23, standing in front of bonfire, he posted saying that now that we've rid the land of the Armenians, now we're going to burn away their aura, standing in front of a bonfire. So you can't really get much more blatant in terms of genocidal intent than those types of acts, including, let's be honest, before the blockade, Azerbaijan had issued a stamp with a guy in a hazmat suit, literally cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, this is, it's a peculiar, almost comical reality of demonstrating genocidal intent. So let's fast forward to where we are today. Now we have Azerbaijani soldiers inside sovereign Armenian territory with no sign of letting up, where they've been demanding control and access to sovereign Armenian territory. That's another issue that's been on the table, where there has been appeasement and handover of villages by the government of Armenia at this point, who's under clear duress. There's no question about that. But I think that if we don't look at it in a historical perspective, we miss the colossal lesson of the post-World War II era. And that is, I don't think that Nagorno-Karabakh is President Aliyev's endpoint. It's the beginning of a process. And what I like to do is liken this to Hitler's taking of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And what we see there was Neville Chamberlain, running from London to Munich, signing this peace treaty he was all happy about. in 1939, running back to London and parading it down the street, claiming, now we have peace. I looked into Hitler's eyes, and he gave me, and he said that he will give Europe peace. Well, we know what happened. And what's interesting after that, it's not only that war followed, outright genocide happened. And so this is the colossal lesson of kind of the world order that we knew, right, post-World War II, was that appeasement doesn't work. And that's exactly what Azerbaijan has been doing. Every single concession has led to more demands. And I do think that Nagorno-Karabakh is the beginning of a process of exterminating Armenians from the South Caucasus. We see that on the, just in terms of the genocidal rhetoric coming out of Azerbaijan. We see that in actual actions taken on the ground. Like I mentioned, there was a demand for villages in the northeast portion of Armenia, and certain villages were handed over to Azerbaijan inside our sovereign Armenian territory. Within hours of that, Azerbaijan renewed its demand for a sovereign corridor through the south of Armenia, connecting it to Nakhichevan and Turkey. So I think that we need to understand this in context. What we're dealing with, and genocides don't happen overnight. It's a process. It's a genocidal process. And what we've seen in the rhetoric, what we've seen in the forcible displacement and the genocide of the Artsakh Armenians, literally uprooting an entire civilization of 4,000 or 5,000 years and moving them out, many being in prison, political figures being in prison, civilians being in prison. So, and obviously POWs as well that have not been released. And at the same time, this upping of demands. My fear with this rhetoric of a peace treaty is that it's going to cause a colossal problem. Because even if there was a successful peace treaty where you have genocidal intent, we know that dictators do not stop at written documents. It's ridiculous to think that, and it's almost silly to propose that as a solution, especially when you're dealing with genocidal regimes. Genocidal, revisionist, extremist regimes don't stop at peace treaties. This is something that we should have learned in 1939 and throughout World War II, and we've seen it repeatedly. We saw it in Rwanda. We've seen it in a number of other places where treaties do not stop genocidal regimes. You have to address the core issue. And that's not happening on the global stage right now with respect to Azerbaijan. There is no pressure being put on Azerbaijan to reform the psychology of genocide, which is fueling what we are seeing on the ground. So my fear is that this rhetoric of a peace treaty, which, mind you, is not being mediated or facilitated by a third party, which means, quite frankly, that the rules of international law are not being enforced to set the parameters of what that peace should look like. In fact, one of the demands, which is almost the most ridiculous of them all, is that Azerbaijan has been demanding that the cases at the International Court of Justice between Armenia and Azerbaijan, be withdrawn as a condition for peace. And that itself is really ridiculous from the prospect of an international lawyer. The idea of a just and durable peace is that it be just. And what better parameters can you set for what is considered a just and durable peace, other than the decisions of the International Court of Justice, which has underlined a lot of things Azerbaijan doesn't like, and that is the fact, for example, that the Artsakh Armenians do have a right of return to their 5,000-year-old indigenous homeland. So I'm afraid that the talk of a peace treaty, not regulated by a third party especially, is going to be an opportunity, if there even was a signed document. I fear that third parties and major powers would then wash their hands of monitoring the situation and would say, well, there's peace. And that would mean that we're going to run into exactly what we ran into post-Sudetenland in World War II, where you're going to have a regime that is committed and outwardly outspoken about advancing into Armenia, which it doesn't even call Armenia. It's important to note that the Baku regime refers to Armenia as Western Azerbaijan. So if the rhetoric's not enough, if the actions are not enough, I'm afraid that even if a peace treaty were signed, which it doesn't look like it would be, but if it is, it would be an excuse for regional and Western powers, especially, to turn their heads away from what's happening, which would be I would say, the nail in the coffin of, for the genocidal agenda and really kind of greenlighting what Baku's intending to do in the region.
Yeah, of course. And then you have, on the flip side, you have Azerbaijan saying things like, oh, well, they're not agreeing to the terms, as if the terms were acceptable, like rewrite your constitution to basically say that we have no connection to this area, which, as you pointed out, has been, people have lived there for 4,000, 5,000 years. And so the demands, much like we see in other situations like with Israel, the demands are absurd and something that you could never legitimately and honestly agree to. So, but then then they go on, the global stage and say, well, they're the ones being difficult. They're not agreeing to the terms. And so it's really their fault that all this violence is happening. And it's a very classic, like, psychological, twisting of the reality. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that global stage, which Azerbaijan clearly seems to have control over, and working whether that be the corporate media or indeed other regimes like puppets, because there's a regional power play here. I mean, you're talking about this access corridor to Turkey. Obviously this is a part of, the former Soviet bloc area. So what is this power play looking like in terms of Turkey, in terms of Russia, also in terms of Europe and the so-called West? What is that kind of regional power play on the global stage look like?
Well, I think that the involvement of all these regional powers, everybody understands the role that Russia has played in the former Soviet Union. There's no question about the fact that it's had, actual boots on the ground and forces in various places, including the South Caucasus. And so I think that's kind of understood, if you will. What's less understood is the role that the West has played, particularly Washington and Brussels, with respect to the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, which in many respects, I have to say, is flawed because of their inability to understand that there was genocidal intent emanating from Baku. And this is understand or ignore, quite frankly, because prior to the blockade, prior to the forcible displacement of over 120,000 Armenians from their indigenous homes, Brussels especially was advocating for coexistence and integration of the Armenian Christians with the Baku regime intent on destroying them. I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous if you think, because there's no basis in international law for putting a victim population into the clutches of the military and political control of a state intent on exterminating them. It doesn't make sense. But of course, that was the rhetoric that was pushed on. And we saw where that led, because ultimately, after Azerbaijan's repeated military attacks on Nagorno-Karabakh and the threat of extermination, the entire population within 3 days was forcibly removed from the property, so from the land. So when we think about kind of the regional powers, you have the big players, right? You've got Washington, you've got Washington, you've got Europe, that are really kind of playing the NATO line, or had been playing the NATO line. And the biggest player, and this is the funny thing about the situation, the biggest player in the region, the biggest NATO player in the region, is Turkey, which itself doesn't recognize the fact that it exterminated 1.5 million Armenians and forcibly displaced the entire civilization in 1915, and has subsequently undertaken cultural acts of cultural desecration and removal of the Armenians even from the soil and the buildings of Western Armenia, which is now Eastern Turkey. So we see that is the major NATO player, and the idea of this forcing a shift away from kind of Russian influence in the region towards West or towards NATO doesn't mean French or German soldiers on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh or in Armenia. It means the influence of the largest NATO player in the region, which is Turkey. And that itself is a dangerous proposition, because we have this underlying history, which, if you step back, in 300 years, when people look back at the history of the South Caucasus, they're not going to distinguish between 1915. This is all one in 2023. This is all one page in a history. And it is attached. In fact, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, had gone to Baku after the 2020 war and said now the souls of our ancestors, and he named viziers from the Ottoman Empire, can rest. And the individuals whom he named were the ones that carried out the eastern flank of the Armenian genocide. So we understand that as Armenians. We understand exactly what he's saying. But unfortunately, with where the West could have been or could be productive is really kind of understanding the historical dynamic here. And you can't have a kind of a Russian-led NATO presence in the South Caucasus without creating the parameters for protection for the survival of the Armenian people, because we have not only rhetoric, but we have actions that show that there is an active attempt to remove Armenians from the South Caucasus. So that's kind of one layer, right? And then, and obviously the Ukraine war and Russia's role in the Ukraine war has played a role in terms of the security environment in the South Caucasus. But we also have kind of a, that's kind of the big power analysis, but we have smaller regional powers that are at play here as well. And I think that really requires some really careful thinking. And namely, Israel has a role in the region. Obviously, Azerbaijan and Iran have a role in the region, and Armenia borders, as we know, Azerbaijan, but it also borders Iran in the south. And there are some really serious considerations regarding the last several years and Israel's, partying it up with Azerbaijan with respect to access to military bases in order to have first strike capability to against Iran. But what we've seen, and I've had the benefit of traveling to the West numerous times since 1990. And I'm sure we'll talk a little about that. There's an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem as well, which has been something on our radar. But one thing that's really interesting is that during the blockade, it was clear to me, because I had made a visit to the West Bank right around that time, June or July 2023. The forcible displacement was in September 2023, and it was clear to me that the actual methods being used to blockade, malnourish, and starve the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, down to the machinery used in terms of scanning devices and cameras, were exactly the same that you saw in the West Bank. So that tells me it's not just military assistance that was coming from Israel to Azerbaijan. It continues to come from Israel to Azerbaijan today. But I think there's quite a bit of methodology. And so when you say in terms of kind of running a narrative in the international world, I think that Netanyahu's government has offered quite a bit of support, not only just in terms of military, which has been extremely significant to Azerbaijan, but also methods and methodology in carrying out not only the blockade, the forcible displacement of the other.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a very frustratingly repetitive notion, and we just had on the program author Zia, who's Kashmiri, and we were speaking about these shared tactics, and in fact, the fact that India and Israel don't just share weaponry, they share ideologies and strategies. And of course, impunity. And, to your point about the fact that you don't just wait for someone with genocidal intent to be, to stop of their own accord, they have to be stopped. And I wanted to draw those connections a little bit stronger here, because last year when we spoke, we also spoke about the connections between oppressions of Armenians and oppression of Palestinians. And there's, in fact, a very geographically identical connection, namely the Christian Armenians of East Jerusalem, a community that's lived there for roughly 1,500 years and are now under threat and have been, but an increased threat due to the Israeli death march of occupation and land grabs. And as you noted in a report from August of last year, quote, since the creation of the State of Israel, the Armenian quarter has lost 90% of its pre-1948 population since the creation of the State of Israel. The Armenian quarter has lost 90% of its pre-1948 population. And that's staggering. And it also speaks to the myriad threat that the state of Israel is. And it also, of course, highlights the fact that, this isn't an issue between Islam and Judaism. Like, that's a completely ridiculous fallacy about the situation, the apartheid state of Israel. And I think that this is one of those prime examples. And it's also not something that's talked about that much, right? Because the way that this is framed is as, oh, the Muslim Palestinians versus the Jewish Israelis. And that's a completely wrong-headed way of looking at this. This is a settler colonial apartheid regime that has in its crosshairs, amongst others, Christian Armenians of East Jerusalem who have called this place home for more than 1,000 years. So, Karnig, could you talk a little bit about the situation there in East Jerusalem and how this is connected to what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh?
I think that's a great question, Eleanor, and I think that you kind of highlighted some of the key aspects to this that people overlook. First of all, what's happened to, the Armenians have the Christian Armenian quarter, which is one of the four quarters, separate from the Christian quarter per se, which is, and I think it's important to kind of understand why that is. Armenian Christians not only have distinct religious differences than obviously the Muslim population, Jewish population of Jerusalem, but they are also ethnically different. Most of the Roman Catholics that live in Jerusalem are not Italians. They're Palestinian Christians, and the Greek Orthodox are not from Athens. I mean, most of them are Greek Orthodox Palestinians. That's not the case with the Armenians. The Armenians that live there are in fact Armenian. I mean, they're Armenian ethnically, and they're Armenian Christians, which is why the Armenian quarter has had a distinct status under the status quo that's supposed to govern the relations in the old city of Jerusalem. And so what we've seen since 1948 is our efforts to infringe on not only the physical territory of the Armenian quarter in the old city, but also on the rights and privileges that Armenians have enjoyed under successive regimes that have governed Jerusalem. We talked about 1948, but as you mentioned, 1,500-year history necessarily entails, Arab domination, necessarily entails Ottoman domination, the British Mandate. I mean, there's plenty of other regimes governed. But what we see post-1948 is really a shocking, you can't dispute the numbers, where it makes it so difficult to live there. And we see this, and obviously in the West Bank, Gaza as well, where it's so difficult to live there, people want to get up and just leave, right? And those tactics really have come to a head with this issue of the Cow's Garden, which is the portion on Mount Zion, which is the hill that Jerusalem sits on. In fact, it's the highest point on the hill of the old city of Jerusalem. There's the Armenian Gardens, it was called, also Cow's Garden, in the Armenian quarter. And what we've seen happening recently, which is what a number of legal cases now are dealing with through the Jerusalem courts, and has been a bit kind of a diplomatic that is, many governments have taken interest in this issue, involves the work of settler organizations working through shell companies that are based in many different places throughout the world. This one in particular being based in, I think, UAE, and owners on their face out of Australia and other places, through quote unquote business deals, accessing and then taking property, and kind of strategic attempts to take property. And the issue with this particular piece is that this particular piece breaks the backbone of what is the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem, because it would not allow Armenians to be able to come into Jerusalem and go to their schools, go to their churches, this space has been used for festivals and festivities. In fact, this garden was the one that housed genocide survivors in 1915 and those that were deported into Syria and Jordan found refuge in the Armenian garden, the Cow's Garden. So, and what's interesting is that the Armenian quarter, when I say attacks, I mean attacks. I mean, there are settler organizations that have attacked with weapons, with attack dogs, and so the community has been able to withstand it largely because of their ability to have international attention to this issue. And we thank your program as well, Eleanor, for raising this issue. It makes a difference because, like you said, there are other aspects to the issue of what's happening in Jerusalem, what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Palestine, than is obvious. And some of these things hint at larger agendas and strategic agendas. And without appreciating that, you look at this as a kind of a bipolar conflict, right? And it's very easy to make it then sound like it's a good and evil conflict. When you look at it, it's a lot more complex than that. And it exposes something that the other Christian communities, the Roman Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, have also witnessed over the course of this last several decades. And so it's really interesting. On our legal team that represents the Armenian community there, we have Jerusalemite lawyers that are Jews and Palestinians, and obviously we have an international team from Armenia across the United States and Europe. And, there is a mosaic, a tapestry of Jerusalem that is unique to the place, that needs to be preserved and needs to be maintained. The Armenian quarter is a powder keg in that. If the Armenian quarter falls, now the Jewish quarter and the Muslim quarter and the Christian quarter have an empty void. And we know in this particular geopolitical conflict that we're witnessing sometimes on TV, but mostly on, alternative media is really kind of exposing what's happening. This is the last place you want to create a vacuum. So it has geopolitical significance in the present moment. Aside from the historical the value to the Armenian people and what's happened in the last, since 1948, but it has geopolitical value, which cannot be ignored. And, by not standing up to what's happening with respect to these encroachments, these really targeted encroachments, we risk creating other fissures that will only inflame. And that would probably be the straw that breaks the camel's back in the region, because we all know the religious significance of that city to all monotheistic religions, but we also know the geopolitical significance of that city. And so I think it's really important to focus on what's happening in the Armenian quarter, not just to protect the Armenian presence, but to protect a very tenuous balance that has been struck for decades in Jerusalem under the status quo, in order to protect those four quarters and allow them to relate to one another in a way that is structured and has the parameters of these rights and privileges that each of these communities have. From an Armenian perspective, it's very important because it is one of the last places where not only Armenian history outside of the Armenian homeland is preserved in its traditional sense, but it also has really significant importance for Western Armenian culture, which was completely destroyed by the Ottoman Empire and continues to be denied by Turkey and Azerbaijan today. So there's a pattern, and I think that it's really, really important to kind of appreciate that. In fact, during one of the attacks by Azerbaijan, you had settlers walking through, or cars coming through the Armenian border waving Azerbaijani and Israeli flags. This is people understand the connections, perhaps a visceral, sometimes in an angry way, but there is real geopolitical significance to what's happening in the Armenian quarter. And the presence of Armenians, just the presence. Forget about the idea that we need to focus on making sure that the population doesn't pass the point of no return with this 90% decrease since 1940. But this could be a very significant powder keg if the encroachments and the attacks by the settler groups are not pushed back. I think that we stand at a very interesting and really kind of delicate balance here that can't be ignored, shouldn't be ignored. in the larger regional calculus.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really speaks to the importance of standing with all of the oppressed, regardless of where they are and who they are. As Chris Hedges put it, you're either with all the oppressed or you're with none of the oppressed. And I think it's very clear that these connections exist, whether we're talking about Kashmir or Palestine or East Jerusalem or Armenia, Congo, Sudan. All of these things are connected, and we have to draw those connections and make it clear that the place to stand is with the oppressed and not with the oppressor. Karnig, I mean, there's a lot to dig into here, and I mean, as always, I very much appreciate you giving this important context. Where is a good place for people to stay up to date on what's going on, whether that be in Nagorno Karabakh or Armenia in general, or indeed East Jerusalem?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few great sources, and in this kind of day and age where diplomacy is being handled online nowadays more than anywhere else. There's a couple for Jerusalem, for the Armenian corridor of Jerusalem. I would recommend Save the Ark. That's Save the and then ARQ, standing for Armenian corridor. So Save the Ark on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Very much up to date details on what's happening on the ground. Very detailed with respect to videos and photos about what's happening. And they were the first to identify the attacks, video people. And incidentally, it's funny that now that you bring it up, I would just recall that, some of those settlers that came with, automatic weapons and attack dogs are American citizens. One guy was from Florida, the other guy was from New York. I mean, this is, we're dealing with a really kind of shocking reality that needs, and this is against Armenian Christians. Again, this is not part of the major narrative that we always hear out there with respect to what's happening in Jerusalem and West Bank, Gaza. So I think that it's really important to Save the Ark would be a great source for what's happening in Jerusalem. Daniel Seidman actually is another great source. Extremely great history with respect to Jerusalem and the tapestry and that unique thing that is that mosaic that's Jerusalem. So I'd recommend Daniel Seidman on Twitter. Very, very useful analysis. And with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, there are a couple of sources. One is Zartonk Media, Zartonk Media is a great source. But in terms of direct information from people on the ground, I would recommend the Artsakh Human Rights Ombudsman's Office, not the Armenian, but the Artsakh Human Rights Ombudsman's Office. That's Keram Stepanyan. That's Stepanyan. And I think that following some of the kind of the notable Artsakh Armenians, kind of really delivers people to kind of cutting edge of some of these major issues. I should also make note, just kind of in closing, Eleanor, if you permit me, there has been some progress. There's the Swiss Peace Initiative that the Swiss Parliament voted on and made into law that requires the Swiss Foreign Office to hold a forum to allow for direct talks between Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh representatives regarding the return. Whether Azerbaijan is willing to participate in those is kind of secondary at this stage, but I think it's important to make sure that the conflict, the issue of the right of return, is on the table and remains on the international spectrum. So, but you'll get a lot of that kind of information from some of the sources that I mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important thing to note when we talk about the right of return. It speaks to the connection to place, which really kind of deflates the settler colonial idea of like the land for a people or a land without people for the people without a land quip that places like Israel likes to, and all settler colonialists like to put out there. So, Karnig, thank you so much for taking the time once again. And folks, please do check out those places that he mentioned. And again, making these connections is really important, and so that we remember that nothing happens in a vacuum, and nobody with genocidal intent will just stop until they are kings of a graveyard. They have to be stopped, and I believe it's all of our mandates to work towards that. So, Karnig, thanks again for taking the time.
Thank you, Eleanor.